My mother called my boss saying I had schizophrenia and was dangerous. I lost my job in 24 hours. When I confronted her, she smiled and said, "Now you'll need me." The termination message appeared on my computer screen at 9:17 on a sunny Monday morning in April, exactly 4 hours after my mother, Vera, had called my boss, Roberto, claiming that I suffered from untreated paranoid schizophrenia and posed an imminent danger to coworkers due to violent psychotic episodes that she invented with details so convincing and clinically precise that they destroyed in a matter of hours a professional reputation that took me 15 years to build meticulously through hard work as a project manager at a multinational tech company where I had always been recognized for exceptional technical competence and especially for the emotional stability that allowed me to manage large teams under constant pressure from tight deadlines and conflicting demands from demanding clients. The formal corporate email signed by the human resources director, who barely knew my name, used legally cautious language about immediate termination of employment contract for cause based on concealment of a serious medical condition that supposedly put the safety of the professional environment at risk, specifically citing concerning reports received from a reliable family source about erratic behavior not previously documented, but which according to the source had manifested progressively during recent months through characteristic symptoms of psychotic disorder including auditory hallucinations during important meetings, growing paranoia about colleagues conspiring against me, and especially a recent episode where I supposedly threatened physical violence against a subordinate during a discussion about a delayed project timeline. Each word of that cold and bureaucratically distant corporate email was like a sharp knife progressively cutting through the tissues of my professional identity that had become a central part of who I was as a person during a decade and a half dedicated entirely to building a solid career that provided me not only comfortable financial stability, but especially a sense of purpose and personal fulfillment that filled the emotional void left by failed romantic relationships and limited social life due to an almost obsessive dedication to work that I always prioritized above other dimensions of human existence. The physical sensation I experienced reading those impossible accusations printed in standardized corporate font was exactly like having air violently expelled from my lungs by a brutal punch to the stomach, leaving me suffocated and disoriented while trying to mentally process how it was possible that my own biological mother had deliberately fabricated such a detailed and clinically convincing narrative about a serious mental illness I didn't have. Directly contacting my hierarchical superior to report false concerns, presented with a tone of genuine maternal urgency that Roberto apparently believed without questioning or independently verifying through direct conversations with me about the disturbing allegations being made against my mental sanity and emotional stability. During the 38 years of my carefully organized life built on foundations of personal responsibility, professional honesty, and especially robust mental health that had always been my greatest pride, considering complicated family history of psychiatric disorders that affected multiple generations, including severe depression, that led my paternal grandfather to suicide when I was only 7 years old. I had never experienced even a symptom of mental illness that would justify psychiatric medication or intensive therapy, beyond occasional consultations with psychologists during stressful periods of academic life and professional transitions that everyone naturally faces without this indicating underlying clinical pathology. My medical history was impeccably clean of any psychiatric diagnosis. My periodic occupational health exams always resulted in excellent evaluations of my physical and mental state, and especially my consistently superior professional performance during 15 years at the same company clearly demonstrated full functional capacity incompatible with paranoid schizophrenia that, according to Vera, I had supposedly secretly developed while maintaining a facade of normality that fooled close colleagues, but didn't escape the maternal vigilance supposedly concerned about progressive deterioration of my mental health. The devastating betrayal of that impossible situation resided not only in the fact that Vera had deliberately lied about my mental condition to professional authorities who controlled my financial subsistence, but especially in the calculated cruelty of specifically choosing schizophrenia as a false diagnosis, knowing perfectly well that this disorder carries massive social stigma that instantly transforms competent people into potential threats in the eyes of corporate employers averse to any legal risk related to employees with serious psychiatric history. And especially knowing that my greatest irrational fear since adolescence had always been developing mental illness, similar to that which destroyed my grandfather and left permanent traumatic marks on the family structure that witnessed his progressive deterioration culminating in self-inflicted death that no one managed to prevent, despite obvious signs that everyone ignored out of social discomfort, about openly discussing mental health in an era when these issues were even more taboo than they continue to be currently. Vera intimately knew this specific fear because during my turbulent adolescence, she frequently used threats about genetic inheritance of mental instability as a tool of emotional control whenever I demonstrated independence or questioned her decisions about my education, relationships, or career choices, maliciously insinuating that any behavior she disapproved of was an early symptom of inherited mental illness that would inevitably manifest fully as I aged following a family pattern she claimed to have identified through generations of relatives who developed various psychiatric disorders during adult life. This systematic psychological manipulation during formative years created chronic anxiety about my own mental sanity that led me to completely avoid use of alcohol or recreational substances that could potentially trigger psychotic episodes, to obsessively monitor my own behavior looking for signs of disorganized thinking or distorted perceptions that would indicate the beginning of mental deterioration, and especially to seek constant external validation through exceptional professional performance that proved to myself and to the world that I was a functionally competent and mentally stable person, contrary to the dark predictions that Vera regularly planted in my vulnerable consciousness. I grabbed my cell phone with hands trembling so violently that the device almost slipped from my fingers, sweaty from acute anxiety that triggered physiological alarm systems, transforming my body into an emergency state characterized by accelerated heartbeats echoing in my ears like war drums, shallow and irregular breathing that couldn't provide enough oxygen to a brain frantically processing the devastating implications of that unjust dismissal, and especially growing nausea that threatened to make me vomit right there over the computer keyboard, still displaying the corporate email that instantly transformed my professional identity from respected manager to dangerous psychiatric patient fired for cause without right to severance pay or positive references that would be crucial for getting a new job in a competitive market where reputation is everything. I dialed Roberto's number with desperate urgency, hoping that direct conversation would allow clarifying the absurd misunderstanding and reversing a hasty decision based exclusively on unverified allegations from a family member he had never personally met, and who therefore had no established credibility to make such serious accusations about an employee with an impeccable 15-year history demonstrating consistent competence and absolute emotional stability. After 7 long rings that seemed like eternities of anguished waiting, Roberto finally answered with a formally distant and visibly uncomfortable voice that immediately revealed that he had already made a final decision and was not interested in reconsidering or even discussing a situation that from the corporate point of view was closed through appropriate legal procedures that protected the company from potential negligence lawsuits if they kept an employee with serious undeclared psychiatric history. Roberto informed me with painful professional coldness that the company had consulted the legal department before making a decision about my dismissal, and that corporate lawyers confirmed that concealment of a serious medical condition, especially a psychiatric disorder with potential for violent behavior, constituted material breach of the employment contract that justified immediate termination for cause without need for prior notice or payment of compensatory severance, normally guaranteed in terminations without cause. Each word he pronounced was an additional hammer progressively breaking my carefully constructed professional reality, and when I tried to explain desperately that I didn't suffer from schizophrenia or any other mental disorder, and that my mother's allegations were completely false, fabricated for personal motivations I still didn't fully understand, Roberto interrupted my stumbling defense with a tone of forced patience, characteristic of hierarchical superiors, who have already mentally decided that a subordinate is problematic, and therefore any explanation offered will be automatically interpreted as pathological denial or conscious manipulation. The devastating phone conversation lasted less than 8 timed minutes, but seemed to extend for hours of psychological torture, while Roberto mechanically repeated points previously prepared by the legal department about corporate policies related to mandatory declaration of medical conditions that could affect professional performance or colleague safety, specifically citing contractual clauses I had signed at the time of hiring 15 years earlier, committing to immediately report any significant change in my physical or mental health state that could impact my ability to execute professional functions adequately. When I hung up the phone after a frustrated attempt to defend my mental sanity against impossible accusations that had destroyed an entire career in an absurdly short period of 24 hours, the complete reality of my situation finally penetrated through the initial shock that had kept me functioning in automatic emergency mode, focused exclusively on trying to reverse the corporate decision, instead of emotionally processing the magnitude of maternal betrayal that Vera had deliberately committed, knowing exactly what devastating consequences her lies would have on my professional life and financial stability. I felt rage growing progressively from the core of my being like volcanic lava heating before violent eruption, mixed with absolute disbelief about the calculated cruelty necessary for a biological mother to deliberately fabricate such a detailed narrative about serious mental illness of her own daughter and directly contact her employer, specifically to destroy a career that represented literally everything I had built during a decade and a half of hard work and almost obsessive dedication. The question dominating my confused mind, oscillating between fury and paralyzing terror, was simply why. What possible motivation could Vera have to elaborate such a malicious scheme whose only predictable result would be my complete professional destruction, accompanied by permanent social stigma, associated with a false psychiatric diagnosis that would follow me during the rest of my life through corporate records and negative references that would make it practically impossible to get an equivalent job at any respectable company in the tech sector where reputation and reliability are fundamental hiring criteria. I drove my sedan to the apartment where Vera had lived alone since my father had died 8 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, crossing the city through busy streets that seemed unreal and distant, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life instead of living my own reality that had transformed into an incomprehensible nightmare during the last 24 hours. The 40-minute journey through intense traffic was a dissociative experience where part of my consciousness clinically observed my own emotional state progressively deteriorating, while another part frantically tried to construct rational explanations that could make some sense of the impossible situation in which I found myself. Perhaps Vera was developing senile dementia that caused delusions about my mental health. Perhaps she herself suffered from undiagnosed psychiatric illness that led her to project imaginary symptoms onto me. Perhaps there was a catastrophic misunderstanding where she genuinely believed she was protecting me through early intervention that would alert the employer about mental deterioration she erroneously perceived through distorted interpretations of normal behaviors during occasional family visits. Each alternative explanation my desperate mind offered was an attempt to preserve some functional image of Vera as a fundamentally good mother, whose destructive action could be attributed to illness or confusion instead of deliberate malice, because accepting the much more disturbing alternative that she had consciously chosen to destroy my professional life through calculated lies would require recognizing that the person who raised me during childhood and adolescence was capable of psychological cruelty I couldn't understand or emotionally process, without questioning basic foundations of my own identity, built on family narratives that now revealed to be potentially false or fundamentally distorted. When I finally parked in front of the modest but well-maintained residential building where Vera occupied a 2-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor, I observed for a few minutes through the windshield fogged by condensation from my irregular breathing while trying to gather enough courage to go up and confront her about the devastating lies she had told Roberto, and especially to demand a rational explanation about the motivations that led her to elaborate such a malicious scheme whose only predictable result was my complete professional destruction. Part of me wanted to simply drive away and never speak to her again during the rest of my life, completely cutting family contact as a form of emotional self-preservation against a person who had demonstrated capacity and willingness to cause such profound psychological damage through deliberate manipulation of professional authorities who controlled my financial subsistence. But another more insistent part demanded answers that could make some logical sense of that incomprehensible betrayal, and especially that could offer some possibility of reversing professional damage through formal retraction that Vera could provide if directly confronted about the devastating consequences of her calculated lies. I breathed deeply several times, trying to control the tremors shaking my body since discovering the dismissal email 5 hours earlier, adjusted disheveled hair that reflected the internal chaos dominating my existence, and finally got out of the car, walking with deliberately firm steps through the parking lot to the building's main entrance, where I mechanically greeted the doorman who knew me from previous visits during years of apparently normal family relationship, but which now revealed to have been built on unstable foundations of psychological manipulation I hadn't recognized due to gradual normalization of subtly abusive behaviors over decades of coexistence. I went up in the old elevator that creaked in protest while slowly transporting me to the 5th floor, each second of ascent providing additional time for growing anxiety about the imminent confrontation that would permanently define the nature of the relationship with Vera, depending on how she responded, when directly confronted about the lies she had deliberately told to destroy my professional career. When I finally rang the doorbell of her apartment after brief hesitation at the closed door, I heard slow steps approaching through the internal hallway and then Vera's familiar voice asking who was visiting without prior notice at the unusual time of mid-afternoon on a Monday when I should be working at the corporate office, managing projects and coordinating teams. Instead of appearing unexpectedly at her apartment, visibly disturbed and seeking answers about a situation she probably knew I would inevitably discover as soon as the company processed the dismissal based on the false allegations she had provided with such convincing details. When Vera finally opened the door, revealing a familiar maternal figure wearing comfortable casual clothes and an initially surprised expression that quickly transformed into something much more disturbing, while her calculating green eyes assessed my deteriorated emotional state, I realized she didn't demonstrate the guilt or remorse expected from someone who had committed a terrible mistake or who had been misinterpreted in a genuine attempt to help a daughter she mistakenly believed to be ill, but rather subtle and carefully controlled satisfaction, characteristic of a person executing an elaborate plan that was functioning exactly as intended from the beginning. I entered the apartment without waiting for a formal invitation, passing Vera, who moved away from the door, allowing my entrance while closing behind me, with a slow and deliberate movement that suggested she had been waiting for that inevitable visit, and had already mentally prepared answers to questions she knew I would ask as soon as I discovered the professional consequences of the false allegations she had deliberately made about my mental health. The familiar living room was impeccably organized as always. Antique furniture inherited from previous generations, positioned exactly as they had been for decades of family coexistence. Framed photographs on the walls showing apparently happy moments from childhood and adolescence that now seemed like evidence of normal family life, masking manipulative dynamics operating secretly under the surface of apparently functional relationships. I turned abruptly to face Vera, who had strategically positioned herself between me and the exit door, as if anticipating I might try to flee before hearing what she had prepared to say, her cold green eyes assessing my emotional state with detached clinical interest characteristic of a scientist observing an experimental subject's reaction to a calculatedly administered stimulus. During seconds that seemed to extend indefinitely through palpable tension filling the space between us, we simply stared at each other in loaded silence of conflicting emotions, where my growing fury collided against the disturbing calm she demonstrated, despite knowing exactly why I was there and what devastating accusations I was about to make against her. The first question I finally managed to articulate through a throat constricted by barely contained rage was simply why, a word loaded with the weight of 15 years of destroyed career, ruined professional reputation, threatened financial stability, and especially irrevocably broken family trust through betrayal, so calculated it defied rational understanding about motivations that could justify malice of that magnitude, directed specifically against one's own biological daughter. Vera remained silent for a moment, carefully considering how to respond, her eyes never deviating from mine while evaluating exactly how much to reveal about the plan she had elaborated and meticulously executed. And finally, when she spoke, her words were pronounced with cold and calculated clarity that left no doubt about conscious premeditation of the actions she had taken, knowing perfectly well what devastating consequences they would have on my life. The explanation Vera offered with a controlled and slightly condescending voice was simultaneously too simple to justify the complexity of the situation and too terrible to emotionally process, without questioning basic foundations of human nature, and especially of maternal bonds that supposedly should be a source of unconditional support instead of calculated destructive manipulation. "You need me now," were the words Vera pronounced with a calculated and disturbing smile after I directly confronted her about the devastating call to Roberto that had destroyed my career in 24 hours, finally revealing through that simple but sinister phrase the true objective behind the elaborate scheme she had meticulously orchestrated during months, planning every detail of my professional destruction as if executing a strategic military operation specifically designed to reduce me to a state of total dependence where I would have no alternative but to accept absolute maternal control over every aspect of my adult existence that I had carefully built during decades of hard work and financial independence conquered through my own efforts without assistance or interference from her. The casual coldness with which she pronounced those words while adjusting decorative pillows on the antique sofa, as if we were having a trivial conversation about weather or cooking recipes, instead of discussing deliberate destruction of my professional life, revealed a level of psychological planning and emotional manipulation that went far beyond simple unresolved family conflict or maternal resentment about life choices I had made against her will during years of progressively distant but apparently functional relationship that masked abusive dynamics operating secretly under the surface of family normality, carefully maintained for public consumption. During the interminable seconds that followed that shocking revelation, my mind tried to frantically process the complete implications of what Vera was so casually admitting through that satisfied smile that transformed her familiar facial features into a disturbing mask of calculated triumph over a victory she had conquered through methods so cruel and psychologically destructive they defied rational comprehension about how far a biological mother could go to subjugate an adult daughter who had committed the unforgivable crime of achieving financial and emotional independence that threatened the maternal control Vera had exercised during all my childhood and adolescence through subtle tactics of emotional manipulation I had normalized as natural aspects of mother-daughter relationship without recognizing abusive patterns being progressively established over decades of coexistence, where each demonstration of my independence was systematically punished through withdrawal of affection, induction of guilt, or veiled threats about terrible consequences that would inevitably result from my selfish choices that supposedly demonstrated profound ingratitude for the maternal dedication she had invested in my upbringing. During years of personal sacrifices, I never adequately appreciated according to narratives she constantly constructed. "What do you mean now I need you?" I finally managed to articulate through a throat constricted by the toxic combination of growing rage and paralyzing terror about the implications of that casual statement, revealing a much more elaborate and psychologically complex scheme than simple, impulsive maternal revenge or punishment for imaginary offenses I might have committed during years of apparently normal but secretly dysfunctional family relationship in ways I hadn't recognized due to gradual normalization of manipulative behaviors that began subtly during vulnerable childhood and progressively intensified as I grew, developing an independent personality that threatened the narratives Vera maintained about the nature of our maternal relationship, where I should remain eternally dependent on her for emotional validation, practical guidance, and especially financial support that would keep me bound through obligations impossible to break, without devastating emotional costs she was willing to inflict whenever I demonstrated signs of excessive independence, challenging her control over my existence. Vera sat calmly in the floral armchair, strategically positioned near the window, filtering afternoon light through antique lace curtains, crossed her legs with a deliberately slow and theatrical movement like an experienced actress executing a performance rehearsed multiple times before the final presentation, and began explaining with a controlled and slightly condescending voice, characteristic of a patient teacher instructing a particularly obtuse student about simple concepts any intelligent person would understand immediately, without need for excessive elaboration. "Marina, you've always been stubborn since childhood, always questioning my decisions about your education, your relationships, your professional choices, always believing you knew better than I what was good for you. Despite all the life experience I accumulated during decades navigating a world much more complicated and dangerous than you ever faced, protected by the bubble of academic privilege you built around yourself working at that tech company, where colleagues admired you and bosses trusted you without questioning your competence or stability," she began with a tone mixing false affection with barely disguised resentment, finally emerging after years being carefully repressed under a mask of genuine maternal concern. "When you decided 10 years ago that you didn't need to live with me anymore in this house where you grew up and were loved unconditionally, when you announced you were renting your own apartment to have independence I was denying you through my protective maternal presence, I realized I was losing control over you in ways that could result in permanent distancing, where you would simply disappear from my life, reducing our relationship to occasional holiday visits and superficial weekly phone calls that wouldn't provide emotional satisfaction or sense of purpose I always obtained through being a dedicated mother, sacrificing my own desires and ambitions to ensure your well-being and professional success." Her words progressively revealed dimensions of accumulated resentment and need for control I had never fully recognized during years of relationship I always interpreted as relatively functional despite occasional tensions I attributed to normal generational differences between mothers and adult daughters navigating transition from hierarchical childhood dynamics to more egalitarian relationships characteristic of independent adults maintaining family bonds by choice instead of obligation or dependence. "During the last 10 years since you moved out, I observed with growing concern how you progressively distanced yourself from me emotionally, even while maintaining appearances of respectful relationship through monthly visits and weekly phone conversations that became increasingly superficial and ritualistically empty of genuine connection or emotional intimacy, that characterized our relationship when you still lived here and depended on me for practical support and guidance about important decisions. Vera continued revealing additional layers of motivations that had fueled elaboration of the destructive scheme. You were building a completely separate life where I was just a peripheral figure kept at safe distance through boundaries you established unilaterally without consulting my feelings or needs as a mother who had dedicated decades to your upbringing and development. The narrative she constructed was simultaneously revealing about her distorted psychology and disturbing in implications about how far she was willing to go to restore control. She felt progressively losing as I established genuine independence, threatening her sense of identity built primarily around being a controlling mother, maintaining a dependent daughter through systematic emotional manipulation, disguised as protective maternal love. When you were promoted 2 years ago to senior manager position with substantial salary that provided you complete financial security, eliminating any practical need for my assistance, I realized I was rapidly approaching the moment where you simply wouldn't need me for absolutely anything beyond superficial social obligations at family holidays. So you deliberately destroyed my career just to force me to become dependent on you, again financially and emotionally? I asked, with a voice oscillating between incredulity and growing fury, facing the casual admission of calculated cruelty, revealing a person fundamentally different from the mother I believed I had known during 38 years of family coexistence. You called my boss inventing an elaborate story about schizophrenia and violent psychotic episodes, knowing exactly this would result in immediate dismissal that would destroy the professional reputation I spent 15 years building, just because you couldn't accept that I had become an independent adult who no longer needed constant maternal supervision? The magnitude of betrayal was finally beginning to penetrate through the initial shock that had kept me functioning in automatic mode during the last hours since the confrontation, revealing a psychological abyss between the perception I maintained about the nature of our relationship and the much more sinister reality of abusive dynamic operating secretly during decades, while I interpreted her manipulative behaviors as normal expressions of protective maternal love instead of recognizing patterns of systematic psychological control designed to maintain artificial dependence, serving her emotional needs at the expense of my development as an autonomous person, capable of functioning independently, without constant maternal validation or approval. Vera nodded calmly, as if confirming a trivial observation about external temperature, instead of admitting having committed an act of deliberate professional sabotage specifically designed to destroy the life her daughter had built through years of hard work and professional dedication. Exactly, Marina. Because you need to understand that the relationship between mother and daughter doesn't simply end when the child becomes an adult and moves to her own apartment believing she's conquered independence through a successful career and comfortable salary. She explained with distorted logic, revealing fundamental disconnect with social norms about adult autonomy and healthy family relationships based on mutual respect, instead of unilateral control exercised by parental figure over eternally infantilized descendant. You'll always be my daughter and will always need maternal guidance to navigate a complicated world full of people who will try to exploit or deceive you because you're fundamentally naive and too trusting to recognize dangers lurking around every corner, waiting for opportunity to destroy unprepared people like you. The narrative she constructed transformed an act of deliberate professional sabotage into a supposed gesture of maternal protection, revealing impressive capacity for psychological rationalization that allowed justifying extreme cruelty as a distorted expression of parental love that only sufficiently sophisticated people could adequately understand without superficial judgments based on limited social conventions about autonomy and adult independence. Now that you've lost your job and are facing financial difficulties that will inevitably arise when savings run out during the coming months of unemployment, while dealing with the stigma of having been fired for cause due to a serious psychiatric condition no future employer will ignore when checking professional references, you'll finally recognize that you've always needed me, and will always need me to survive in this cruel world that punishes vulnerable people without mercy. Vera continued, revealing the full extent of the plan she had elaborated during months before executing the phase of professional destruction. You can come back to live here with me where you always should have stayed, where I can properly care for you and protect you against the terrible consequences of your impulsive and poorly considered choices that always result in disasters requiring maternal intervention to correct. The scenario she painted was a nightmare of forced infantilization and artificially created dependence through deliberate sabotage, transforming a competent adult woman back into a dependent child through systematic destruction of foundations, supporting autonomy and independence, that had been conquered through years of conscious effort to establish a life separate from the suffocating family dynamic Vera maintained as the ideal of healthy maternal relationship. You won't have a choice but to accept my help because no other person in the world will love you enough to bear the burden of caring for someone with destroyed professional reputation and documented history of serious mental instability that drives away employers, friends, and potential romantic partners who will naturally avoid involvement with a person marked by psychiatric stigma that follows like a permanent shadow. The shocking clarity with which Vera articulated a strategy of destruction, followed by controlled rescue, revealed a manipulative mind operating at levels of psychological sophistication. I had never imagined possible in a maternal relationship I always interpreted as relatively normal, despite occasional tensions I attributed to natural differences between generations and divergent personalities navigating shared spaces of family coexistence. While she continued explaining details of the elaborate plan she had executed with surgical precision during months of meticulous preparation, I gradually realized I was confronting a person fundamentally different from the mother I believed I had known during 38 years of shared life, where I interpreted controlling behaviors as normal expressions of parental concern instead of recognizing systematic patterns of emotional abuse disguised as protective love. Exclusively designed to maintain control over a daughter who should remain eternally dependent and submissive to maternal wills, presented as wise guidance from an experienced figure who knew better than an immature child what was necessary for survival and success in a dangerous and unforgiving world. During the last 6 months since I began planning how to restore appropriate balance in our relationship that you had destroyed through your excessive independence and progressive emotional distancing, I extensively researched paranoid schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders to ensure my narrative about your supposed mental illness would be clinically convincing enough to be accepted without question by corporate employers who naturally prefer to eliminate potential risks instead of carefully investigating allegations made by concerned family members. Vera revealed with disturbing pride about the investigative work she had done preparing the destructive scheme. I read academic articles about characteristic symptoms, typical disease progression, specific behaviors that untreated patients demonstrate in professional environments, and especially learned exactly which details to mention during conversation with your boss to activate corporate safety protocols that would result in immediate dismissal without need for independent verification or consultation with you about the veracity of allegations. The meticulousness with which she had prepared devastating lies demonstrated a level of premeditation and conscious planning that transformed what could have been an impulsive act of maternal revenge into a calculated operation executed with coldness, characteristic of a professional criminal instead of a mother supposedly concerned about her daughter's well-being. I called your company's office pretending to be extremely anguished and worried about progressive deterioration of your mental health that I had observed during months through family visits where you demonstrated increasingly alarming symptoms, indicating urgent need for medical intervention. You were stubbornly refusing to accept due to lack of insight, characteristic of psychotic patients who don't recognize their own illness. She continued describing execution of the plan with disturbing detail, revealing satisfaction about the convincing performance she had presented to Roberto during the phone call that destroyed my career in a matter of minutes. I explained to him that as a concerned mother, I had a moral obligation to alert the employer about potential risks you represented to coworkers due to episodes of growing paranoia where you accused people around you of conspiring against you, auditory hallucinations that distracted you during important meetings, making you respond to voices only you heard, and especially increasingly aggressive and threatening behavior when contradicted about professional decisions, demonstrating progressive loss of control over violent impulses characteristic of untreated paranoid schizophrenia. Each detail she reported was like an additional dagger, piercing my understanding about who she really was as a person, capable of fabricating such an elaborate and destructive narrative about her own daughter, without demonstrating remorse or guilt about the devastating consequences she knew perfectly well would result from the calculated lies. Roberto initially hesitated when I began reporting your supposed deteriorated mental conditions, mentioning that you had always been an exemplary employee during 15 years working at the company, without ever demonstrating signs of instability or problematic behavior that would justify concerns about professional capacity. Vera admitted, revealing she had faced initial resistance she needed to overcome through additional manipulation and increasingly convincing fabricated details. But when I explained that psychotic disorders frequently manifest gradually over years where patients maintain a facade of normal functionality, while the disease progresses secretly until reaching a critical point where sudden collapse becomes inevitable, and especially when I mentioned that you had specifically begged me not to tell the employer anything because you were afraid of losing your job due to stigma associated with mental illnesses, I finally managed to convince him he was dealing with a serious situation requiring immediate action to protect everyone's safety in the corporate environment. The skill with which she had manipulated Roberto through emotional appeals mixed with apparently credible technical information demonstrated impressive psychological sophistication, explaining how she had managed to control aspects of my life during decades, without me fully recognizing abusive patterns operating under the surface of carefully maintained family normality. When Roberto asked if you were receiving adequate medical treatment for the serious condition I was describing with so much worrying detail, I explained while convincingly crying that you had refused all my attempts to convince you to consult a specialized psychiatrist, and that you were completely denying the existence of any mental problem despite increasingly obvious symptoms that any trained person would immediately recognize as indicators of psychotic disorder, rapidly progressing to dangerous stages where urgent intervention became absolutely necessary to prevent potential tragedies. Vera reported with evident satisfaction about the theatrical performance she had executed during the decisive call. I suggested that perhaps he could gently recommend you seek professional help through mental health resources offered by the Corporate Benefits Program. But I specifically warned that people with paranoid schizophrenia frequently react with extreme hostility when confronted about the need for treatment, because they interpret any suggestion in that direction as part of an imaginary conspiracy to control or harm them in some way. The psychological manipulation with which she had constructed a narrative that simultaneously incriminated me as dangerous an established expectation that I would react defensively to any verification attempt demonstrated profound understanding about how corporate systems function when confronted with allegations about potentially problematic employees coming from apparently reliable and genuinely concerned family sources. Roberto thanked my courage in coming to him with such difficult information about my own daughter, praised my maternal dedication in placing other people's safety above family loyalty, and especially assured me he would handle the situation with appropriate sensitivity while taking necessary measures to protect the work environment against documented risks I had reported so detailedly during the emotionally charged but professionally informative conversation. She concluded, revealing Roberto had completely accepted the fabricated version of events, without questioning veracity or seeking independent confirmation, before processing the dismissal that would permanently destroy my professional reputation. Obviously, he consulted the corporate legal department before making a final decision about your contract termination. But lawyers confirmed that concealment of a serious medical condition, especially a mental disorder with potential for violent behavior, constituted sufficient material breach to justify dismissal for cause without need for prolonged investigation or defensive hearings that would only complicate the process and potentially expose the company to additional legal risks if you really were dangerous and caused harm to someone after they had been alerted about the problem, but failed to act decisively. The corporate logic Vera had so effectively exploited revealed sophisticated understanding about how business organizations prioritize protection against legal liabilities above justice for individual employees when confronted with serious allegations from apparently credible sources. While processing shocking revelations about the extent and sophistication of the scheme Vera had elaborated and meticulously executed, I began finally recognizing historical patterns of emotional manipulation I had normalized during decades of coexistence, interpreting controlling behaviors as expressions of protective maternal love, instead of abusive tactics designed to maintain artificial dependence and control over progressively larger aspects of my existence. Specific memories I had filed as isolated incidents of excessive but well-intentioned maternal overprotection began reorganizing into a new configuration, revealing a much more sinister narrative of systematic psychological abuse operating consistently through formative years when I was developing identity and establishing foundations of self-confidence that Vera had deliberately undermined through subtle criticisms disguised as constructive guidance, unfavorable comparisons with other children presented as motivation to improve performance, and especially veiled threats about terrible consequences that would result from independent choices, challenging the absolute maternal authority she maintained over all aspects of domestic life. I recalled a specific incident from adolescence when I was 15 and had been accepted into an international student exchange program offering opportunity to spend a semester in another country, developing language skills and cultural experience that would be valuable for personal development and future academic opportunities. Vera had initially feigned enthusiasm about the academic achievement, publicly congratulating me during a family dinner where relatives praised my school performance that had resulted in competitive selection for the prestigious program. But during the following weeks, she began systematically undermining my confidence through apparently casual comments about dangers of traveling alone in a foreign country, where an inexperienced young person could easily become a victim of criminals exploiting vulnerable tourists. Serious tropical diseases that frequently affected unprepared visitors without adequate immunity against local pathogens, and especially concerns about how prolonged absence could negatively affect school performance when I returned facing readjustment difficulties to the domestic curriculum after months studying in a completely different educational system. Gradually, through constant repetition of these concerns, presented as genuine maternal protection instead of calculated manipulation, Vera had managed to convince me to decline the exchange opportunity that represented a unique chance for independent development away from her controlling influence during a crucial formative period of adolescence. Another pattern emerging with disturbing clarity through reevaluation of archived memories involved romantic relationships I had tried to establish during years as a young adult, navigating transitions between dependent adolescence and adult autonomy threatening maternal control. Vera exercised through progressively more sophisticated tactics as I developed capacity to resist manipulations too obvious. Every time I began seriously dating someone during university years and early professional career, Vera found subtle ways to undermine the relationship through veiled criticisms about my partner, presented as legitimate concerns from an observant mother who recognized problematic signs the infatuated daughter ignored due to judgment compromised by hormones and romantic inexperience. Apparently innocent comments about how my boyfriend seemed too controlling or too distant, too ambitious or insufficiently motivated, excessively sociable or too introverted, were strategically planted during casual conversations where Vera pretended to support the relationship while simultaneously sowing doubts that grew progressively until I began questioning compatibility and eventually ending relationships that could have evolved into serious partnerships, providing me emotional support. Independent of maternal approval she used as a control tool over decisions and behaviors. The most disturbing pattern I recognized through this retrospective reevaluation involved professional choices I had made during years building a career in technology that Vera had subtly directed through suggestions presented as wise guidance instead of manipulation designed to maintain some level of control over professional trajectory, threatening to make me completely financially independent and therefore capable of establishing geographical and emotional distance that would eliminate her influence over daily aspects of my existence. When I was considering accepting a job offer in a distant city that offered substantially higher salary and accelerated professional advancement opportunities, but would require moving to a location where I didn't know anyone and would be isolated from family support networks, Vera had orchestrated a subtle campaign of discouragement, focused on risks of relocating to an unknown place without established support system that could provide assistance during emergencies or difficult periods inevitably arising when a person finds themselves alone in a completely new environment, navigating challenges without guidance or support from people who genuinely care about their well-being. Eventually, I had declined the tempting offer, maintaining local employment that paid less, but allowed maintaining geographical proximity with Vera, who presented this proximity as an advantage, instead of recognizing it was exactly what she desired to maintain control over aspects of my life through constant involvement, disguised as natural maternal support. You're finally beginning to understand the real dynamic of our relationship that I've always carefully structured to ensure you never completely distanced yourself from me, establishing total independence that would eliminate my relevance in your life and leave me alone without purpose or meaning after dedicating decades to your upbringing and development. Vera observed, perceiving the expression on my face, revealing mental processing of memories being reorganized into new configuration, exposing historical patterns of systematic manipulation. Each important decision you believed you were making autonomously based on independent judgment and rational analysis of available options was in reality the result of careful guidance I provided through subtle methods you interpreted as genuine maternal support instead of recognizing as calculated direction, designed to keep you close and dependent in ways that served my emotional needs to continue being a relevant and necessary mother, even after you technically became an adult capable of functioning independently. The casual admission about systematic manipulation during decades of relationship I had interpreted as relatively healthy, despite occasional tensions, revealed a psychological abyss between the perception I maintained about the nature of the maternal bond and the much more sinister reality of emotional abuse operating consistently under the surface of carefully constructed family normality. Why are you telling me all this now instead of simply remaining silent about your real motivations, letting me believe the call to Roberto was an error of judgment or misunderstanding about my mental health, instead of openly admitting it was deliberate sabotage designed to force me back to dependence? I asked, trying to understand the logic behind revelations so explicit they destroyed any possibility of future reconciliation or maintenance of even superficially functional relationship after such devastating admissions about systematic manipulation. Vera smiled with an expression mixing satisfaction with something more disturbing I can only describe as sadistic pleasure about the psychological power she exercised through control over the narrative, and especially through knowledge that I was completely vulnerable now without employment, without professional references, and with destroyed reputation that would make it extremely difficult to rebuild a career or establish financial independence that would free me from the need to accept her assistance during a prolonged period of unemployment and recovery from professional damages she had deliberately inflicted. I'm telling you exactly how I planned and executed the destruction of your professional career, because I want you to perfectly understand it wasn't an accident or misunderstanding, but rather a conscious and deliberate choice I made after months of careful planning. And especially because I need you to recognize, I have the capacity and willingness to cause even more devastating damage if you don't accept the conditions I'll establish for our future relationship, based on a structure of dependence that always should have been maintained instead of allowing the illusion of independence you cultivated during the last decade. Vera explained with shocking clarity, revealing not only the cruelty of the original scheme, but also implicit threats about additional consequences should I refuse to submit to the control she planned to reimpose through exploiting the vulnerability artificially created by professional destruction. You need to understand I'm a person willing to do absolutely anything necessary to keep you close and dependent, because you're my life's purpose and only source of meaning, keeping me functioning after losing your father and facing the reality of aging alone, without immediate family providing sense of connection and relevance. All humans need to avoid descent into depression and hopelessness, characterizing lives of isolated elderly people, without close family bonds justifying continued existence. The revelation about deep motivations behind controlling behavior offered some psychological understanding about the origin of abusive patterns, but absolutely didn't justify or excuse the extreme cruelty she had demonstrated through deliberate destruction of my professional life. If you really needed closer family connection and greater involvement in my life, you could have simply talked honestly with me about feelings of isolation and loneliness, instead of destroying my career through elaborate lies designed to force me into dependence through professional sabotage. I argued, trying to find some rational logic in behavior that seemed fundamentally incomprehensible in its calculated cruelty. I would have listened to concerns about emotional distancing and worked to establish a healthier balance between adult independence and maintenance of meaningful family connection, without need for destructive tactics that completely eliminated any possibility of rebuilding a relationship based on trust or mutual respect after revelations about systematic manipulation during decades. Vera shook her head with an expression of exaggerated patience, as if dealing with a particularly obtuse child, incapable of understanding simple concepts any functionally intelligent adult would immediately recognize without need for detailed explanation. Marina, do you really believe you would have voluntarily sacrificed your conquered independence and successful career to spend more time with me or involve me more meaningfully in your life, just because I asked politely during an emotional conversation about my needs as a mother facing growing loneliness? She asked with evident skepticism. You would have offered comforting platitudes about family importance and empty promises to visit more frequently or call regularly, perhaps even fulfilled these promises superficially for a few weeks before gradually returning to the previous pattern of progressive distancing, as professional demands and social life consumed time and energy, leaving only crumbs of attention for an elderly mother who supposedly should be grateful for whatever minimal contact you graciously granted between more important and interesting commitments. The cynical characterization she presented about how I would have responded to direct requests for greater involvement revealed profound distrust and accumulated resentment during years observing my progressive distancing. She interpreted as maternal rejection instead of natural development of adult autonomy, characteristic of healthy transitions from childhood dependence to mature independence. By deliberately destroying your career and professional reputation through false allegations about serious mental illness, I guaranteed you'll have no alternative but to return home where I can properly care for you during the prolonged period it will take to rebuild professional life, if you even manage to do that, considering the permanent stigma associated with dismissal for cause, due to a psychiatric condition no future employer will ignore during background verification processes. Vera continued detailing the long-term plan she had elaborated. During months, or possibly years, you'll spend living with me again while looking for employment and trying to rebuild your destroyed career. We'll have opportunity to reestablish appropriate dynamic of maternal relationship, where you recognize fundamental dependence on guidance and support that only a dedicated mother can provide in a cruel world, exploiting vulnerabilities of people without strong family protection networks. The scenario she painted was a nightmare of totalitarian control disguised as protective maternal love, revealing fundamental inability to recognize appropriate boundaries between parental figures and adult descendants who deserve autonomy and respect as independent individuals instead of perpetual extensions of parental identity, existing primarily to serve emotional needs of narcissistic mothers incapable of allowing healthy separation. The complete revelation about the extent and nature of the scheme Vera had elaborated completely transformed my understanding not only about the specific incident of professional destruction, but about the fundamental nature of the maternal relationship that had characterized my entire existence from birth to the present moment of devastating confrontation in her apartment, where masks finally fell, revealing a much more sinister reality operating secretly under the surface of family normality. I had maintained through denial and rationalization of obvious signs I should have recognized years before if I had been willing to question comfortable narratives about unconditional maternal love, instead of accepting manipulative behaviors as normal expressions of parental concern. All mothers supposedly demonstrate in varying degrees, depending on personalities and specific circumstances of each unique family dynamic. I left Vera's apartment without uttering an additional word, after that devastating revelation about the complete extent of the manipulative scheme she had orchestrated during months to deliberately destroy my independence conquered through decades of hard work. Walking through the silent hallway with legs that trembled, but managed to sustain the weight of my body, propelled by growing rage finally replacing initial paralyzing shock. Each step distancing me from that suffocating living room where masks had finally fallen, revealing sinister reality operating secretly during my entire existence, was simultaneously liberation from comfortable illusions about the nature of maternal relationship and devastating recognition that I would need to completely rebuild foundations of my identity that had been built on false narratives, carefully maintained by an experienced manipulator, disguised as a loving mother concerned exclusively with her daughter's well-being. I ignored her voice calling my name through the open door, trying to make me return to continue a conversation she believed had established definitive terms about future relationship based on forced dependence and absolute control. But I had no intention whatsoever of accepting the scenario she had so confidently painted about my inevitable surrender to circumstances artificially created through calculated professional sabotage. During the journey back to my apartment, through streets that seemed unreal under late afternoon light, transforming the familiar city into an alien landscape, reflecting disconnection between apparently normal external reality and internal turbulence, processing revelations that had completely demolished understanding about family relationships, and especially about how far a supposedly loving person could go to maintain control over a descendant who committed the unforgivable crime of achieving genuine independence. I began mentally formulating an action plan, rejecting completely the narrative of victimization and dependence Vera had so carefully constructed. The first conscious decision was to absolutely refuse any scenario where I would accept assistance from her, or return to live in the apartment where she maintained totalitarian control, disguised as maternal protection. Recognizing that accepting any form of support from her at that moment of professional vulnerability would be exactly the trap she had meticulously planned when she decided to destroy my career through elaborate lies about mental health. I needed to demonstrate to myself, and especially to her, that I was capable of navigating the devastating situation without succumbing to the dependence she had worked so systematically to create through deliberate sabotage. Even if this meant facing substantial financial difficulties during a prolonged period of unemployment and professional reconstruction that would inevitably be complicated by stigma associated with dismissal for cause due to false allegations about serious mental instability. As soon as I arrived at the apartment that had been my sanctuary of independence during the last decade, but now seemed vulnerable and precarious considering financial uncertainty created by sudden loss of employment, providing economic stability necessary to maintain that personal space away from maternal interference, I immediately began researching available legal resources to contest unjust dismissal based on false allegations fabricated by a malicious family member who had deliberately sabotaged my professional career through convincing lies about non-existent psychiatric condition. The first call was to Patricia, a 43-year-old old work colleague who had become a close friend during years collaborating on complex projects where we developed mutual trust and professional respect, transcending superficial relationships typical of competitive corporate environments. When Patricia answered the phone after 3 rings, her voice had the worried quality characteristic of someone who had heard rumors about my sudden dismissal, but didn't fully understand the circumstances that had led to such abrupt contract termination of an employee who always demonstrated exemplary competence and unquestionable emotional stability during 15 years working at the same company, building solid reputation as a reliable manager capable of leading large teams under constant pressure from tight deadlines and conflicting demands from multiple demanding stakeholders. During the 40-minute phone conversation that followed that initial contact, I detailed to Patricia the entire impossible saga that had begun with Vera's call to Roberto, falsely claiming I suffered from untreated paranoid schizophrenia and posed imminent danger to colleagues due to completely fabricated violent psychotic episodes. Progressing through dismissal for cause, processed with impressive speed by the corporate legal department, prioritizing protection against legal risks above justice for employee with impeccable history, and culminating in the devastating confrontation at her apartment, where she openly admitted having orchestrated an elaborate scheme specifically to destroy my independence and force return to dependence she maintained as ideal of appropriate maternal relationship. The shocked silence following the end of my detailed narrative lasted long enough for me to begin worrying the phone connection had accidentally dropped. But finally, Patricia broke that tense silence with words revealing profound indignation, mixed with determination to help contest injustice, as flagrant as what I had experienced through combination of family malice and corporate negligence, resulting in career destruction based exclusively on unverified allegations from external source without established credibility. Marina, this is absolutely outrageous and completely unacceptable both from ethical and legal standpoints. And you have substantial rights that can be exercised through appropriate labor processes against the company that fired you for cause, without even giving you opportunity to respond to devastating allegations or provide medical evidence contradicting the false psychiatric diagnosis your mother deliberately fabricated, Patricia declared with conviction, providing the first sense of hope I had experienced since discovering the dismissal email the previous morning. I know an exceptional labor attorney named Dr. Alice, who specializes exactly in cases of unjust dismissal involving discrimination against people with supposed medical conditions, and she has an impressive track record of victories in courts against companies violating employee rights through hasty contract terminations based on unverified allegations about physical or mental health. The concrete suggestion about specific legal resource that could help contest dismissal and potentially restore professional reputation, destroyed by Vera's lies, offered a tangible path forward instead of simply accepting the scenario of victimization and dependence she had so confidently constructed as inevitable. Patricia also offered to formally testify about my consistently exceptional professional performance, and especially about complete absence of any erratic behavior or symptoms of mental instability during years working closely on projects requiring constant coordination and clear communication that would be impossible to maintain if I really suffered from serious psychotic disorder, as Vera had falsely alleged to Roberto. The next call was to Daniel, a 40-year-old ex-boyfriend with whom I had maintained a serious romantic relationship for 3 years before ending it amicably 2 years ago due to fundamental incompatibilities about future plans involving marriage and family. He wanted to establish while I prioritized professional career development, requiring full dedication, incompatible with domestic responsibilities. Traditional matrimonial relationships typically impose on female partners, regardless of theoretical arrangements about equitable division of domestic work and parental care. Despite the romantic ending, we had maintained respectful friendship based on years of emotional intimacy and especially mutual understanding about psychological vulnerabilities we had shared during the relationship period, when I had revealed details about complicated family dynamics with Vera. I now recognized as obvious signs of systematic emotional abuse. I should have identified years earlier if I had been willing to question comfortable narratives about maternal love, instead of normalizing manipulative behaviors as excessive but well-intentioned parental concern. When Daniel answered my unexpected call, his voice had an immediately alarmed quality characteristic of someone who recognizes through tone that the call wasn't social, but rather a request for help during significant crisis requiring support from a trusted friend, capable of offering external perspective on emotionally charged situation. During the following hour of therapeutic conversation, where Daniel listened patiently while I reported the entire devastating sequence of events from Vera's call to Roberto to the confrontation at her apartment where she openly admitted orchestrating an elaborate scheme to destroy my independence. He offered crucial emotional validation I desperately needed after hours processing alone such profound betrayal, and especially revelations about decades of systematic manipulation that had shaped important decisions I always believed I was making autonomously based on independent judgment instead of calculated direction disguised as wise maternal guidance. Daniel recalled specific conversations we had during our relationship where I mentioned Vera's behaviors. We then interpreted generously as excessive maternal overprotection, but now clearly recognized as abusive tactics designed to maintain control and dependence through systematic emotional manipulation, operating consistently during my entire life, from vulnerable childhood to the present moment of devastating confrontation. Most importantly, he emphatically assured me I wasn't alone navigating that impossible situation and that I could count on his practical support during the difficult period of professional reconstruction, and especially during the process of establishing appropriate boundaries with Vera. That would protect against future manipulation or sabotage attempts she would certainly try to execute when she realized the original plan to force dependence through professional destruction hadn't worked as expected. The morning after that sleepless night, emotionally processing the magnitude of maternal betrayal, and especially formulating concrete strategies to contest unjust dismissal and rebuild professional life without succumbing to the dependence Vera had worked so meticulously to create, I called Dr. Alice's office, scheduling an urgent consultation to discuss available legal options for suing the company for discriminatory dismissal based on false allegations about psychiatric condition I didn't possess, as could easily be proven through medical records impeccably clean of any diagnosis related to serious mental disorders. Dr. Alice was a 46-year-old woman with impressive professional presence, combining technical expertise about labor legislation with genuine empathy about devastating emotional impacts, unjust dismissals cause in victims who lose not only source of income but especially professional identity, carefully constructed during years of dedication and hard work. During a 2-hour meeting in her impeccably organized office filled with legal books and especially certificates demonstrating specializations in labor law and discrimination cases, she meticulously reviewed all documentation I had brought, including dismissal email, records of consistently exceptional professional performance during 15 years at the company, and especially complete medical history, demonstrating total absence of psychiatric diagnoses or treatments related to mental disorders Vera had falsely alleged. Marina, you have an extremely strong case for labor lawsuit against the company that fired you for cause-basing decision exclusively on unverified allegations from a family member without even giving you opportunity to respond to accusations or provide medical documentation contradicting the false psychiatric diagnosis presented as established fact instead of allegation requiring independent investigation before taking measures as drastic as immediate contract termination. Dr. Alice analyzed with professional authority, providing growing confidence about viability of contesting dismissal through appropriate legal channels. Labor legislation is absolutely clear about prohibition of discrimination against employees based on real or perceived medical conditions, and the company violated multiple legal protocols by processing dismissal without independent medical verification or defensive hearing where you could present evidence contradicting allegations about mental instability that were accepted without question, simply because they came from a family source. Corporate authorities incorrectly assumed to be reliable and well-intentioned instead of recognizing possibility of malicious motivations or false information being deliberately reported. She explained in detail the legal strategy involving simultaneously suing the company for unjust discriminatory dismissal, seeking reinstatement to employment with retroactive compensation for lost wages and substantial moral damages, and also seeking protective measures against Vera, including restraining orders that would prevent future interference attempts in my professional or personal life. Through unauthorized contacts with employers or other authority figures, she might try to manipulate using similar false allegations. Parallel to labor legal actions, Dr. Alice strongly recommended consulting Dr. Fernando, a 57-year-old psychiatrist specialized in forensic medical evaluations, who could conduct comprehensive psychiatric examination, formally documenting absence of schizophrenia or any other psychotic disorder Vera had falsely alleged, creating official medical record that would serve as crucial evidence in judicial processes against the company, and especially would definitively establish that her allegations were completely fabricated instead of mistaken, but intentioned interpretations about behaviors she had erroneously observed as symptoms of mental illness. Consultation with Dr. Fernando 2 weeks later was simultaneously validating and disturbing experience, where I spent 3 hours answering detailed questions about personal history, current functioning in multiple life areas, including interpersonal relationships and professional performance, and especially about the nature of relationship with Vera. Revealing patterns of systematic emotional manipulation, he immediately identified as psychological abuse, characteristic of narcissistic parental figures, incapable of allowing healthy separation from adult descendants. At the end of the comprehensive evaluation, he issued a formal 15-page report meticulously documenting that I presented no symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia or any other psychotic disorder, that cognitive and emotional functioning was completely intact, demonstrating full capacity for complex professional work, and especially that allegations made by Vera were inconsistent with clinical presentation observed during detailed evaluation and with documented history of exceptional professional performance consistently maintained during a decade and a half. Judicial process against the company was formally initiated 6 weeks after unjust dismissal, and during the following months of complex legal proceedings involving depositions from multiple witnesses, including Roberto, who was forced to explain under oath why he had accepted Vera's allegations without independent verification, corporate lawyers repeatedly tried to negotiate extrajudicial settlement involving modest financial compensation in exchange for my agreement not to seek reinstatement to employment or public admission of corporate guilt for violation of labor rights. I consistently refused all settlement offers that didn't include complete reinstatement to previous position with full restoration of professional reputation and especially public retraction about false allegations that had been accepted without adequate questioning, insisting that the objective wasn't simply obtaining financial compensation, but rather establishing precedent that companies cannot fire employees for cause-basing decisions exclusively on unverified allegations from third parties, without appropriate investigation respecting basic defense rights and legal due process. Patricia testified eloquently during deposition about my impeccable professional performance and complete absence of erratic behaviors or signs of mental instability, effectively contradicting the narrative Roberto had accepted from Vera about progressive deterioration she supposedly had observed during months before deciding to make an alarming call to employer alerting about risks I represented to colleagues. Final confrontation with Vera happened not in court during the process against the company, but rather in family mediation session ordered by judge as part of proceedings to obtain restraining order that would prevent future interference attempts in my professional or personal life through unauthorized contacts with authority figures. During the tense meeting supervised by professional mediator trained in family abuse dynamics, Vera initially maintained defensive posture, claiming her actions had been motivated exclusively by genuine maternal concern about my well-being, and that any damage caused was unintended consequence of well-intentioned efforts to protect me against dangers she genuinely believed I was facing due to worrying signs she had mistakenly interpreted as symptoms of serious mental illness. The mediator directly confronted these rationalizations, presenting documented evidence about meticulous planning Vera had admitted during our initial confrontation, including extensive research about schizophrenia specifically, to fabricate clinically convincing narrative, and especially explicit admission, that the objective had been to deliberately destroy my independence to force return to dependence. She maintained as ideal of appropriate maternal relationship, confronted with impossibility of maintaining narrative of well-intentioned maternal concern facing overwhelming evidence about calculated and malicious nature of her actions, Vera finally began demonstrating genuine emotions for first time during the entire devastating saga, but instead of remorse or guilt about damages caused, what emerged was profound rage about being publicly exposed and especially about failure of the plan she had so carefully elaborated. You've turned me into a villain when all I ever did was try to keep you safe and close because I'm your mother and have the right to be involved in your life instead of being discarded as inconvenient when you decided you didn't need me anymore because you conquered financial independence and successful career that made you erroneously believe you could function completely alone without family guidance or support. Vera declared with bitterness, revealing fundamental inability to recognize problems with her behavior or accept responsibility for damages caused through deliberate sabotage. The mediator intervened, firmly establishing that the session wasn't opportunity for Vera to continue trying to justify actions or blame the victim for having established appropriate boundaries, characteristic of healthy adults maintaining family relationships by choice instead of obligation. but rather space for her to acknowledge damages caused and especially agree to terms of restraining order that would prevent future interference or manipulation attempts. Eventually, after hours of tense negotiation, Vera reluctantly agreed to comprehensive restraining order, prohibiting any direct or indirect contact with me, including specifically prohibition on contacting current or future employers, work colleagues, friends, or other people in my life with allegations about my mental health or any other information designed to damage reputation or personal and professional relationships. Judicial process against the company culminated 9 months after initial dismissal and favorable verdict, ordering immediate reinstatement to position with retroactive compensation for all wages lost during forced unemployment period. Substantial moral damages recognizing psychological suffering caused by unjust discriminatory dismissal, and especially public retraction through corporate communication, acknowledging that allegations about mental instability had been false, and that dismissal for cause had violated basic labor rights by processing contract termination without independent medical verification or appropriate opportunity for defense. Roberto was demoted from managerial position to individual function without supervisory responsibilities, as consequence of having demonstrated deficient professional judgment by accepting serious allegations without adequate investigation, serving as example for other managers about importance of verifying information before making decisions permanently impacting careers and lives of employees. Return to corporate environment was initially uncomfortable considering colleagues had heard rumors about reason for dismissal, and some maintained cautious distance, uncertain about how to interact with someone who had allegedly been mentally unstable. But gradually, through consistently exceptional professional performance, and especially through Patricia and other vocal advocates who explained the true nature of situation involving malicious family sabotage instead of genuine mental health problems, I managed to rebuild reputation and professional relationships that had been temporarily damaged by Vera's lies. 3 years have passed since that devastating Monday, when I discovered the dismissal email that transformed apparently stable life into nightmare of family betrayal and prolonged legal struggle to restore reputation and independence Vera had tried to destroy through elaborate scheme based on false allegations about mental instability. During this intensive period of personal and professional reconstruction, I learned fundamental lessons about importance of establishing healthy boundaries in family relationships, and especially about recognizing signs of emotional manipulation before they escalate to active sabotage of autonomy and independence conquered through hard work. Relationship with Vera was permanently altered by betrayal, and especially by revelations about decades of systematic manipulation that had shaped important decisions I always believed I was making autonomously. And although the restraining order expired after 2 years, I maintained voluntary distance, recognizing that a person capable of elaborating and executing such destructive scheme wasn't someone who should have access or influence over my life, even if we shared biological bonds. Society typically venerates as sacred and unquestionable, regardless of toxic or abusive behaviors demonstrated by parental figures. Weekly therapy with psychologists specialized in relational trauma and family abuse has been crucial for processing complex emotions about loss of comfortable narratives about childhood and maternal relationship, and especially for rebuilding sense of identity, not defined by external approval or validation, but rather by internal understanding about values and objectives I choose to pursue independently of expectations or demands from other people, including family members who believe they have rights over decisions and trajectories of adult descendants. Today, I can say with certainty I'm a stronger person and especially more conscious about power dynamics operating in family relationships, frequently romanticized as unconditional sources of love and support, when reality can be much more complex and sometimes fundamentally toxic in ways requiring protective distancing instead of blind loyalty based exclusively on biological bonds. The devastating experience of having my career deliberately destroyed by a manipulative mother taught me that genuine adult autonomy sometimes requires courage to completely break with parental figures who demonstrate inability or unwillingness to respect appropriate boundaries, and that choosing self-preservation over maintenance of dysfunctional relationships isn't selfishness, but rather healthy recognition that all people, including adult descendants, deserve to live free from manipulation, control, and especially active sabotage of independence conquered through own efforts. I share this story not to generate compassion or external validation, but rather to alert other people who may be navigating similarly toxic family dynamics about importance of recognizing signs of emotional abuse before they escalate to active destruction, and especially to affirm that reconstruction is possible even after betrayals as profound as what I experienced through person who should have been primary source of unconditional support, but chose to be deliberate architect of my temporary destruction, that fortunately didn't manage to achieve final objective of reducing me again to infantilized dependence she maintained as ideal of appropriate and eternally immutable maternal relationship. Did you enjoy Marina's story? Then subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.